that only 15% of respondents were confident that their asset information is accurate. Now, from a surveying perspective, one of the frustrations has to be that FMCos or client-side organisations sometimes as well, investing in good asset data is so fundamental, but is something that is so overlooked because there isn't an obvious return on that investment, because they think maybe we can get away with not having done it for a period of time.
That's Mark Whittaker, General Manager at Thomson FM, an independent facilities management and lifecycle cost consultancy that provides specialist advice to organisations across a multitude of sectors. He believes only approximately 15% of FM organisations trust their asset data, and that gap causes all manner of issues for public sector clients at Handback.
We don't necessarily work from today's date forwards, we kind of work from the Handback date backwards in terms of understanding what is achievable, what needs to be done.
In this episode, we discuss the importance of working backwards from the Handback date, exactly what must be done when, and why a single agreed survey methodology stops two conflicting data sets from triggering an expensive Handback conflict. I'm Louis Blaxall, and this is The Surveying Shift. Welcome to this episode of The Surveying Shift. And joining me today is Mark Whittaker, General Manager at Thompson FM, one of the UK's leading independent FM consultancies, and a really interesting guest that's slightly different to our usual surveying guests on this episode, because we're talking about PFIs, and we're talking about PFIs more holistically. We'll talk about where surveyors fit in with them, but we'll also provide an FM angle. And Mark is perfectly placed to talk about all of that because he has been working on some of the most complex PFI contracts in the country. Mark is a certified IWFM member, and until recently he served as chair. So alongside the day job of advising authorities, SPVs, FM contractors on PFI compliance and handbacks, he's one of the leading voices shaping the profession nationally. So Mark, over to you to do a quick introduction to Thompson FM and your role in it more broadly.
Thanks for the opportunity just to be on the podcast. Thomson FM as a business, we've been operating for just over 23 years. Like you mentioned, we're an independent facilities management consultancy. We started off 23 years ago on some of the very early PFI schemes, and interestingly enough, on some of the ones we're working on now, we're getting towards the end of expiry on some of those schemes. I suppose from a perspective of our business, we work across a range of different sectors as well as PFI. We've got a team of 15 people that work directly for us with a whole range of different skill sets, really. So yeah, that's our business in a nutshell. We're kind of UK based here in Lancashire, but we've done global projects as well.
For those who perhaps are earlier in their career or haven't had the chance to work on a PFI contract, if you could give a kind of broad overview, I appreciate it's a multi-year engagement, but to try and piece it together so that everyone has a view of kind of what's involved at the start all the way through to the expiry. Are you able to give an overview of what a PFI contract looks like?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose they were kind of PFIs in themselves when they were first kind of came to fruition in the 90s. It was a means of getting that private finance and borrowing really that wasn't necessarily available to governments at that particular moment in time. So there was an opportunity for cheaper borrowing and a commitment by the Labour government of Tony Blair at that time really to try and improve the infrastructure, which had been underinvested for a long, long time. And it was seen as a mechanism really to improve the state of the healthcare and education sector in particular. So from our perspective on some of those early PFI schemes, we were involved in the bid phase of that, and it was very much looking at the kind of the life cycle of those particular properties and what amounts of money were going to be required to maintain those properties during that 25 years, 30 years, 35-year duration, with a view that eventually, at some point, at the end of that those properties then will be handed over to whether it be the local authority, whether it be the NHS trust, whether it be the academy trust or whoever that owns that particular building at the end of that concession period. There was a number of FM companies that were involved at the very early stages of these PFIs, and during the course of the actual FM companies involved sometimes have changed hands, either through, like Carillion, of going under, and other organisations taking that on, or sometimes organisations wanting just to sell their stake in that PFI and that FM co and it passing to somebody else. So yeah, it's been seen as a mechanism really of improving the infrastructure. I suppose it goes without saying that there's mixed views on the success of it, that you have a look at the quality of the schools, hospitals, health centres and the like on particularly the PFI schemes, and there has been some great buildings that have been built and there's lots of good stories on it. There's also a lot of bad press that sometimes comes with it as well, saying that lots of organisations have profited from it, and perhaps that the charges that have been levied over that period of time are significantly above what market should have expected to have to pay. So whether it be trusts, local authorities, some commentators have argued that they've paid a lot more than they should have needed to, just because of the way that the original contract was actually first kind of drawn up.
Obviously, you mentioned you were there at the start, as it were, and you helped shape some of those contracts. Now we're 25 to 30 years into those, and that is inevitably meaning expiries, meaning handbacks, and people are, well, certainly the surveying world is becoming more cognizant of PFIs and the potential opportunities they present from a commercial perspective. How big a thing, and how do you, I mean, more broadly than necessarily just the surveying world, but how well prepared do you think the industry is to deal with these handbacks, particularly as you referenced, some have been really well maintained, some have been set up really well from the start, others perhaps less so. What do you think is coming for the industry in the next kind of 10 years?
There's a lot of different variables and dimensions to how successful it's going to be. I suppose that there's been a lot of assistance for local authorities, NHS trusts in particular, that have been given, that was previously from the IPA, Infrastructure Project Authority, that gave kind of indications then of saying you need to start planning for your handback 7 years in advance. And there's been a lot of good practice documentation that's been given to the market to assist in that one. I think that a key element to it, also one of the variable factors that will change from different PFI contracts to another, is the fact of it's very much depending on the relationship between the client, the SPV, and the FM co as well, and that can vary quite considerably. And I suppose, I suppose the link with surveying as well is the criticality of the whole area of asset data, the maintenance records in particular as well, but particularly for asset data, condition data. Some of the early PFIs that now are in the process of being handed back generally were less specific on the handback requirements than some of the ones that came on later. So I suppose the argument is that there is more potential areas of conflict or debate between parties if the handback requirements aren't as clearly stated as they could be. And so that's where some of those factors are, but there's certainly lots of guidance out there. I think it really depends on, as well, in organisations, as to how much planning they have put into that whole handback process. Because as you can imagine, there's been a lot of personnel changes in that kind of 25, 30 years as well. And that's a whole other issue in terms of the trail of what's gone on over that period of time, and how that then is kind of brought together in readiness for handback to understand exactly what's gone on and what is documented and what's been agreed during the course of that time as well.
I mean, sure, there are lots of telltale signs, but it'd be interesting to get them from you when you look at a PFI contract, whenever you get involved in it, if you were involved from the start or actually you came in midway through. What are the telltale signs of something that you can assume is going to be relatively smooth come handback, and every party is going to walk away from it looking relatively good? Where are the telltale signs of actually that might not be occurring?
I think from our perspective, because we very much, when we're involved, we come at it very much from a kind of a technical element to it. Telltale signs for us, really, I suppose, is looking at fundamentally at the asset data, and also aligned to that is the condition data, and then also the maintenance records. Now, if it's quite clear that asset information hasn't been updated or is accurate, that's going to lead to a lot of issues, because then it's kind of, how do you prove that you've been maintaining an asset when you haven't got proper records of it over a period of time, and tracking of the condition of it, and has it been properly maintained therefore over that period of time. So a telltale sign for us really, I suppose, when you're looking at some of these handbacks, is having a look at the quality of the asset data, the quality of the maintenance records, the quality of the O&M manuals, and the room data sheets and as-built drawings as well. So there's all this kind of data that should be there, and if it's not readily available and hasn't been updated, or is sitting in a plant room, photocopied fourth generation there, or it's in somebody's office, but that's when kind of alarm bells will be thinking this is an area of potential conflict at Handback, if it's only at the latter stages that they're trying to catch up on some of this information.
And you mentioned, the asset data and that probably being, or rather the condition data being most prevalent in the mind of surveyors. Where is it important that the FM consultancy or the FM provider or contractor rather interfaces and gels really well with the surveyor? I mean, it'd be interesting to get your take on being on the other side of the fence, as it were, to many of our listeners, where it's really important they work collaboratively and things run really smoothly. Yeah,
and I suppose as with a lot of the asset surveying projects, it's really, really important right from the outset to get the brief right as to what is expected to be collected and the criteria that's being used in the format of that data is going to be presented. I think the key element really is understanding, when, particularly with the life cycle planning, is the fact that the guidance has been very much is to get your handback surveys, condition surveys done in plenty of time in advance of handback, so that if they are flagging certain things that need to be done, because you may have certain assets that are C or D, for example, rated, and that there's a life cycle responsibility for it to be replaced, then that's got to be agreed with the authority and with the SPV potentially between them, and then those life cycle works kind of implemented as well in sufficient time before the handback is ready. Because one of the worst scenarios would be is to have this whole kind of, I won't say backlog, but a huge amount of work that needs to be done in terms of life cycle replacement works prior to it being handed back to meet the contractual obligations of handback. And that's why I think really the guidance from the IPA that's been replaced by NISTA now is very much kind of pushing people to saying, get your planning done early, work with your surveying companies to get the data the way you need it to be, and understanding what the condition of these assets are, and then really start agreeing as to what life cycle replacement works need to be done to meet the criteria at handback for the condition of those assets.
And you talked about the gathering of those conditions, and obviously the majority of our listeners will be well experienced in condition surveys more broadly. How does a condition survey vary, and what are the really important nuances to understand? And have you seen people fall into the pitfalls of approaching this in a more traditional kind of condition survey approach?
From our perspective, in terms of looking from our experience and generally understanding what the market is there, it's really important in terms of the condition reporting that they've access to all of the information in advance of understanding where they're going to be surveying, so there aren't any areas that are missed. So the brief as to what assets and responsibilities are is quite, needs to be really, really clearly stated in the surveyor's brief. But also just that pre-planning stage is really, really important, because if that isn't done, then a surveying company may well go and do what their standard output will be, or their standard approach to this will be, and then that's reported back, and that may not necessarily, it sounds really simplistic, but may not meet the client criteria, and then saying, well, actually, no, that wasn't what we're looking for. This has been, the approach taken, or the areas that have been looked at, or the way that approach the kind of condition reporting isn't what it needs to be. And I think that's where it can fall down. Surveying companies have got the competence and ability and expertise and experience of being able to do it. But sometimes it's also a matter of educating the clients in terms of agreeing, this is what the format's going to be, this is how we're going to approach it. Can we have all this information in advance so we can understand exactly where we're going to need to be surveying, and where your areas of responsibility are, and what falls within the PFI contract and what is not? Because, as I mentioned to you before, that sometimes there can be variances along the way of these PFI contracts, and understanding that what falls into this surveying scope as well.
Hey, here's something I hear a lot. Keeping up with QA, auditing and regulations feels like a full-time job. And indeed, for some of our customers, it is. With Go Report, QA and compliance doesn't have to be complicated. Our smart reporting templates are built around industry standards, and all your notes, photos, and comments are saved on our system so you and anyone else reviewing your reports has the full picture. If you want to simplify QA and compliance, click the QR code or see the link in the show notes. Now, back to the episode.
It's an interesting one in terms of the responsibility of the surveyor in that pre-planning phase, because obviously really clearly outlining the scope is absolutely critical, as you've kind of outlined there. But if they're getting a sense that, I suppose, that they can only be as educated or as structured as the customer is to a degree, in the sense that if they're not providing them with the right information, then that can, I imagine, cause challenges as well if they haven't got a firm grasp on exactly what needs to be done. And as you said, till the data comes in, then they go, hang on, actually, I needed a bit more.
Yeah, and I suppose this, particularly when we're kind of reporting on assets that may be in condition C or D, particularly where, what format of reporting on the condition do you want that to take as well, so that it doesn't require, toing and froing and lots of queries, but also potentially needing a revisit to clarify any certain items. So yeah, it's the format of the reporting is particularly important. Obviously, it sounds really, really simplistic in that it should run smoothly, but you do see instances where it doesn't, and there can be that gap in terms of that client expectation and what the surveying company or the surveyors think the client's going to be require as part of the survey outputs. And there's sometimes, can be that difference that needs to be kind of resolved and involves and sometimes in a bit of a kind of a toing and froing situation, really, to get to where they need to be in terms of the data that they get in return.
And are surveyors and or the clients ever given the opportunity to draw in expertise like yours if they feel like there is a gap? Do you feel like do you think that's done enough in terms of, actually we need someone with a slightly firmer grasp on exactly what needs to be captured here?
Probably now and again we do get involved, but I think on the vast majority of the cases, with all to be fair to the surveying companies out there, they understand exactly what the requirements are and what needs to be recorded. I think sometimes, as I say, from a client side perspective, sometimes it's just the education part of what the approach is going to be. So yeah, I invariably I think that particularly as more and more of these PFIs are being handed back, the kind of level of understanding and expertise in terms of what needs to be recorded and the format of how it's been presented back will get more and more commonplace. But yeah, I think the surveying companies themselves have got that expertise of understanding clearly what it is they should be looking at, because also during the course of the PFIs anyway, there's going to be some periodic requirements anyway to be doing condition surveys anyway. We do that on some, particularly within the prison environments, that where we've been to some of the properties where periodically every 2 years we're there to update that information, and I suppose the benefit of that is the fact of that level of continuity, that we understand what assets are there, can look at previous records of what's been recorded, and then can update the condition reporting of those assets.
You would expect a surveying firm to come in kind of 5 to 7 years before, having done, maybe they would have even run PPMs before that, but certainly would have been brought in 5 to 7 years before the expiry, to allow, as you said, for that time, and hopefully involved before. How frequently do you see that continuity? I don't know whether that's a luxury that's relatively rarely afforded or.
Yeah, I'm not too sure really, because I think there's a lot of companies that are doing some of the big surveying companies out there are obviously doing a lot of work on the expiry surveys, who may not necessarily have been involved previously, but the authority, the trust may have kind of kind of gone to an approved list as such, maybe, and gone with particularly one of the bigger surveying companies to be able to do that. And they may not have had an involvement before. And to be fair, sometimes there's also a benefit in that, because they take a fresh viewpoint to it, an independent, fresh viewpoint of going in there and looking at things slightly differently as well. So I suppose there are benefits. But I think the big thing is making sure that there is sufficient time in terms of doing those surveys, analysing the results, linking it to the life cycle responsibilities, and then understanding what needs to be done in advance of the handback. That's utterly crucial, and not leaving it too late and thinking. And I suppose one of the biggest challenges out there that we're seeing as well is that organisations actually putting the resource aside to do the handback planning as well, and it's not just an addition to the J job. As you can imagine, the J job takes over, and then suddenly kind of all the handback planning isn't really as detailed as it needs to be, and then it's only towards the latter stages that suddenly lots of resources being put in there, because it's looming frighteningly on the horizon. It needs dedicated resource well in advance to start planning that really, and to getting everything together.
You mentioned throwing resource at it when things become more acute. Is there, because I'm sure you will have been in situations where the reality is you've just been brought in perhaps to rectify a situation where they've left it too late, and at that point they really do need some expertise, and someone who's done it before can't afford to make any missteps, as it were. Is there any advice you'd give at that point in terms of prioritization, in terms of executing these things quickly and or effectively, or is it just a case of do what you can in the time is allowed?
From our perspective, from some of the expiries more recently, we've been involved in assisting with the planning on. We don't necessarily work from today's date forwards. We kind of work from the handback date backwards, if you know what I mean, in terms of understanding, okay, what is achievable, what needs to be done,
to be realistic,
and where are the key. Again, it sounds obvious, but where are the key risks? What are the priority tasks that can be done in that period of time? And I think as well, when you're looking at the resourcing side of things, another key element to it as well, which we can't kind of lose sight of, is the level of resourcing out there that could potentially support it isn't necessarily prevalent. You only need to kind of look in terms of some of the regular adverts you may see on LinkedIn for recruitment companies that are trying to kind of recruit kind of PFI managers or PFI handback managers and the like. There aren't a lot of people out there that are available to do that, and I think that's where we've been asked to come in sometimes, where clients are actually struggling to get the resource in to be able to do it, or they just need, like I mentioned before, a dedicated resource that can just purely concentrate on that, and whether it be on a particular project that maybe 3 or 4 members of our team may be actually kind of working on that particular handback project, like we've got one at the moment, or with different areas of responsibility in terms of that. Sometimes it can be kind of needing to get that resource really concentrated on there from a consultancy perspective, because it's difficult to recruit sometimes for those roles.
You can only see that skill set growing, I suppose, over the next few years. But if there is a shortage at this point in time, then those skills are highly
and there's a lot of people that have been involved in PFIs that are during the course of the contract that now kind of no longer around because they've retired, and we don't because we don't we've not had new PFI schemes in the recent past. You've got people that have joined existing ones, but they're obviously they're going to be expiring. But you've also got people, as I say, that's left the workforce. And generally within the FM profession, there is a skill shortage. There is a lack of technical skills because those people that have left the workforce have not necessarily been replaced by people, because there aren't the numbers coming through to do that. So it's a tough one out there, really.
Yeah, worth mentioning APSAS at this point, because you are clearly trying to do something about that and support the industry and grow and shine a light on the importance of really technically capable people. So, certainly worth you just mentioning the good work you're doing on that front.
Yeah, well, I suppose what we wanted to do, and this is a group really of people that within the industry what we decided to do is to say, listen, everybody talks about kind of differing levels of skills within the asset surveying marketplace, particularly for mechanical electrical surveying, and there isn't any kind of level of competence that measures how competent people are to be actually doing the surveying work. But also, on the same token as well, there's an education piece for clients to understand what level of expertise you should expect from a surveyor that's going out there as well. So what we decided to do is we set up the Association of Professional Standards for Asset Surveying, APSAS. We launched that 12 months ago, and the main objectives of really doing it was, first of all, involving the wider industry, which is what we did to shape how that should look. But the core objectives really is to improve the competency levels within the profession by training and competency assessment, but also fundamentally to offer career pathways for people so that they could, anybody that's interested in joining the profession could see actually this is,
there's a clear route.
There's a clear route, a clear means to progress, but also to be able to get an ability to help them along that pathways, really. So that's why we set the association up. That's why kind of only recently now we've launched our level 1 and level 2 training courses, so that they've got an online course that results in them to take an exam and then to pass that either level 1 or level 2 competence, with the hope that that's as an industry kind of, let's say, kite mark, but understanding that that's a level of competence that somebody's kind of at that level. So if they are procuring surveying services, a client-side organisation can stipulate that they want the surveyors to be at level 2.
At a certain level.
Yeah. It's
a great initiative, and given pretty much supporters of it. And actually, it'd be interesting to do another podcast on the thinking behind that and the shine a bit of a light on it, because it's a great movement. Kind of, I suppose, bringing you back to the PFI side of things, it was quite interesting. You mentioned the kind of continuity and the, I suppose, the shared or carried forward understanding of an asset or what's gone on before. Another interesting thing of contracts of this length is the changing landscape of kind of building regulations. So you've got the Building Safety Act, the Golden Thread notion coming through. I'm always interested in understanding how that's impacted, what can't have been baked in at the start, and what the expectations are associated with that, and whether there are any contravening assets that you go, actually, whose responsibility, and how do we make sure that when we do hand it over, it is fully compliant? How has that impacted conversations, and how should surveyors think about that side of things?
There's a few elements too, I suppose, really, when you're looking at the kind of the requirements, and I think just going to a point I alluded to before, really, is the fact that during the course of that PFI contract, there may have been some variations that have been agreed, and we've, it's almost sometimes been kind of like a telephone conversation or something, or email exchange where it hasn't been properly documented. But everybody assumes that was the case. And when you're coming back to the handback requirements and what's agreed and what the responsibilities are for the FM co or for the trust and for a building, and for somebody to say, well, that was agreed 10 years ago, that we're not responsible for that. The difficulty sometimes is because, like I mentioned before, that people have changed. That can be a difficulty in terms of understanding what is in scope and what's out of scope. I think the interesting thing as well from the Building Safety Act kind of aspect of it is the fact that it's reiterating good practice that should have been there in the first place anyway. So accurate asset records and adequate then PPM regime and compliance records should be a given. But for those of us in the industry for a number of years know that it isn't a given. And even this last month, SFG 20 have published a report on the state of the industry, or the state of the FM industry, and did the usual data in terms of asking respondents as to how confident are they in the accuracy of their asset registers. And even from last year's report, it's gone down, I think, from something like 23% to 15%, or something along those lines. Okay. That only 15% of respondents were confident that their asset information is accurate. Now, from a surveying perspective, one of the frustrations has to be that FMCos or client-side organisations sometimes as well, investing in good asset data is so fundamental, but is something that is so overlooked because there isn't an obvious return on that investment.
It's the first thing to go, right? It's the where can we cut? Where can we get away with it for another year type mentality.
It is, and we work, we work for organisations, particularly local authority, non-PFI areas, as well as the fact that they're wanting to move to a different operating model, and whether that be, for example, a corporate landlord model or something similar to that. Everything that they want to do within that, and certainly in terms of their asset management planning, which is really prevalent. We're doing a lot of work on that at the moment, for example, is all underpinned by good asset data, good systems and processes. Again, it sounds really, really obvious, and for years and years and years, the industry hasn't been where it's needed to be, despite lots of us saying, why are we not being able to?
We're trying to run and do the stuff up here when we haven't got the foundations.
Yeah, absolutely. Why are we not in a position where we can evidence compliance? So why is it the fact that we will spend all that money on getting surveying companies to go out there 5 years ago, and then not thinking, actually, we need some protocols in place for updating that asset information during the course of after that, so we can make sure that return on the investment is there, so that we've got up-to-date records. Again, it sounds really, really simplistic, but as an industry, sometimes the FM industry, particularly in terms of asset data and the quality of that, does let itself down, and has done for a number of years.
I'd be keen to, again, from a surveyor's perspective, talk about the criticality of the surveyor's survey and the condition survey that they're doing as part of this. And I can't remember what it was I read. I think it was something like a third of handbacks are expected to be disputed by authorities. And I don't know whether that's reflected in your experience of it, but it'd be interesting to maybe take a spectrum, obviously an anonymized example, but of where the evidence has been from a condition survey has been scrutinized under a microscope in one of those disputes, and it's held up really well, and the surveyor's done a fantastic job, and perhaps an alternative one where it has been challenged and it hasn't necessarily stood up to scrutiny, and the things that were done really, really well, and the things that perhaps could have been done better. I don't know whether you have that spectrum.
We haven't as yet from our own consultancy background, and I think from generally in the industry at the moment, it's difficult because nobody wants to necessarily shout too much about when things aren't going particularly well, really. So trying to find out you may get some good stories of things that have got, initially have done really well, but then you've got when things aren't going well, they won't necessarily hear about it unless, like with the example of Stoke Schools, the BBC get hold of it, and then I remember a few months ago that listening to the BBC News and at breakfast time, and it was the first story on the news at the 8:00 news about it. So I think from things have kind of gone well. I think organisations that may kind of, whether the Trust SPV and FMCO come to a kind of tripartite agreement to say we're going to instruct this company to do the asset surveys because we trust them, and we'll work together in terms of developing the survey brief, so that there isn't a level of duplication of FMCO getting their own asset condition surveying done, and the trust or the education authority, local authority getting theirs done. So that level of collaboration at that particular point, I think, is really, really important, and that's where it's going to work well. It's not going to work well if you've got two sets of data from two different surveying companies that are wildly different, and that's when I think it's going to be kind of really start getting complex, and there'll be a lot of toing and froing because there may be some discrepancies in terms of how asset condition has been classified, because there's those discrepancies as well, really. So I think that's the level of collaboration is really, really key. But I suppose really that goes back to the point that I made right at the start in terms of some of the successes are down to relationships. And it seems as though from what I've heard so far of the ones that I've heard have gone successfully, it's been on the basis of a really good relationship between FMCO, SPV and the authority, for example.
Whereas less adversarial. It's
and it's kind of been doing it in partnership. And to be honest with you, sometimes as well, what's happened is the fact that FMCO has then continued with the contract post expiry, obviously on a different kind of commercial sounding because they won't necessarily be responsible for lifecycle anymore, but they're getting a good service and they don't necessarily want to change that. But I think where the relationship is not working well, and where there isn't a level of collaboration, and where there's a level of distrust and suspicion that maybe the FMco will try and get away with not doing what they should have been doing and try and disguise that fact and that level of distrust, that's when it will get, I think, areas of conflict and distrust and a lot of kind of discussions potentially involving solicitors involved in that, really, to try and reach a resolution that might be protracted over a period of time because that level of trust isn't there.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I was thinking, throughout all of this, inevitably I've been thinking, okay, what does a surveying firm who knows there is an opportunity? I mean, inevitably there is a commercial opportunity there for surveying firms, and there will be for the next 10 to 15 years as these come to expiry. What do you think is really critical that a surveying firm does? Some will be already on that journey, and as you said, there's some really good surveying firms who are already doing that out there, who are actually working with us in a number of instances. But if you're thinking about dipping your toe, or you think you've got the requisite skill set to do that, what are the steps you would suggest taking? Where would you look? How would you upskill your team to make sure you can deliver PFI surveys well, or get into that space slightly more?
Yeah, well, I suppose there's plenty of guidance out there, as I say, from what was IPA NISTA as well, in terms of what requirements are and what the reporting is going to be and what needs to be done in terms of the handback surveys as well. It's really important, obviously, to develop relationships particularly with the end user clients sometimes as well, that are going to be requiring the surveys to be done. I think it's important, useful as well, given that there is publicly available information on what expiries are going to be coming up and when, that can then start planning in terms of which ones may be in particularly geographical areas you may be particularly strong, but also just getting the good news stories out there where things are going really, really well, and you've got a client that's prepared to put it in writing just how good the service has been received, so that can be transferable, so that you've got that independent referenceability really from another client to say they're really, really good. And I think the relationship side of things is really, really key, because you can understand, given the amounts of money that's involved in the handback, that the clients are going to want them some reassurance really in spending this money on the survey that they're going to get the required outputs, because if they're not, it really, really compromises the success of the handback and all other areas of that activity that follows on from the condition surveys and looking at the life cycle planning and what needs to be done in advance of the handback.
Most surveyors listening will have come across PFI buildings and perhaps been involved in some of the contractual kind of machinery behind them, but some won't have a really good understanding of the different players involved in it. So you've got your SPV, your FM contractor, your authority, and the payment mechanism that sits behind it. Quite often surveyors are at an arm's length because they are focused on the condition survey, just at a high level, because I think it's important if you're entering into these, you have an appreciation for everyone who's involved. Could you walk us through how that structure kind of shapes what happens on the ground?
It can be quite complex, actually, to be honest with you. It's not all easily kind of defined necessarily, because some PFI schemes are very, very different to others, really. But I suppose that the trust and the authority really are there, that they've kind of entered into this contractual agreement knowing that a point in time, whether that be 25 years, 30 years, that the property, the buildings are going to be handed back. You've got the SPV there that's managing that interactions between the trust authority and also the management of the FM company to make sure that they are delivering on the contractual obligations. And from an FMco perspective, then clearly their responsibility, sometimes they will have life cycle responsibility, sometimes they won't, but they would have bid that particular contract on the basis of maintaining the assets within a particular building for the contract duration, but also during the course of that particular PFI scheme, whether it be, as I say, 25 or 30 years, a requirement to replace those assets that would have expired their natural life cycle expectancy, so that by the time that it's handed back, for example, they need to make sure that it's been properly maintained and in a condition of, say, for example, in usual one of the condition B, but is of a certain age as well. So it's all about kind of the managing of performance of the data. There's been a lot of key role of SPVs as well as kind of looking at the kind of the payment mechanism, the penalty side of things as well, which is particularly prevalent, where the FM co may not necessarily be performing the way that they need to have been performing, and there may be unavailability or other issues that meant that it's subject to penalties as well. So it can be very complex, different type of arrangements. I think fundamentally, though, I think it's a good point that you make in terms of the surveying side of things, is that it's really important for a surveying company to understand exactly where they fit in all of this as well. How is their outputs going to be used? What, seems, again, probably sounds obvious, but I think it's really important to understand exactly where their role is within all of this, and particularly within Handback, the criticality of what they're doing really, and the accuracy of their information, because fundamentally that's going to underpin a lot of the Handback kind of negotiations and agreements based on what assets are in there and what conditions it's been reported as.
Yeah, and I think recognizing that it does underpin a lot of the conversations that then come after, and the ramifications of the condition survey is really critical to being part of that. And we'll talk about, as you did, relationships and various other things, the impacts of that output can have on those, and communicating that in the right way, and not just handing over a survey and washing your hands of it. It's really
absolutely
critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much for joining, Mark. Really appreciate it. And it was a very, very interesting conversation. I think the big takeaway from my side, and I will give you the opportunity to kind of give a key takeaway as well, but you talked about time, you talked about relationships, you talked about making sure that the process, or the steps in the process, are followed. And it sounds like most people get themselves into trouble when they try and cut corners, or they haven't been doing the right steps throughout the PFI contract. So spotting those signs as early as possible, and then joining the process at the right time, and leaving enough time at the end of the contract is going to be absolutely critical for all of these PFI contracts coming to expiry over the next few years. But yeah, sorry, over to you for
you're absolutely right. I suppose the key takeaway from my perspective really is from a surveying perspective, understanding the key role that surveying and the data that comes from that surveying plays within the Handback, and I suppose the key element to it that has been a mantra for all the Handbacks has been to start planning that early and putting enough sufficient time and resource into the Handback process. And I suppose the final takeaway really is the fact that, to a point that I made earlier on, really is the fact that although there is a lot of bad publicity about PFIs, there's a need not to generalise that all of them are awful and that organisations are paying over the odds, and some companies have made an absolute killing out of them. Yes, that has happened, but also there's been a lot where that isn't necessarily the case, and we're now, anybody that has children, for example, will understand just how good some of the buildings, the schools are now, but also those of us that visiting hospitals and health centres as well. Just the infrastructure has greatly improved in the last 30 years. So who knows what comes next in terms of what the next stage of a PFI arrangement that the government decides to potentially take us on. But I think it's delivered a lot of benefits. I wouldn't necessarily have a general view of negativity on that. There's some really good stuff that's happened as a result of PFIs.
No, I think that's a very fair and uplifting point to end on. So thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's episode or it gave you some food for thought, be sure to follow our show on your preferred podcast platform. To learn more about what we do at Go Report, visit goreport.com. The links are also in the bio. Until next time.